The smell hit Corporal Daniel Hayes first, a mixture of blood, mud, and something worse. Death. It saturated the air of the makeshift field hospital on Okinawa's southern coast, where the 96th Infantry Division had set up operations after 3 days of brutal fighting. It was April 4th, 1945, at 2:17 in the afternoon, and Daniel Hayes was 23 years old and exhausted in ways he hadn't known were possible. He'd been a medic for 14 months, had landed on Leyte, survived the Philippines, and thought he'd seen everything war could show him. He was wrong. "Corporal Hayes!" The shout came from Lieutenant Morrison, the division surgeon, emerging from the main surgical tent with blood-stained gloves. "We've got a situation. Japanese soldier, critical condition, brought in from the cave-clearing operation. He's asking for someone. Won't say what he wants. Just keeps repeating one word. American, American, please." Daniel's hands tightened on the supply crate he was carrying. In 14 months, he'd treated hundreds of wounded soldiers. All American. All his brothers in arms. The idea of treating a Japanese soldier, one of the men who'd killed his friends, who'd fought with suicidal desperation for every inch of this cursed island, made his stomach turn. "Sir, I'm needed with the—" "Corporal, that's an order." Morrison's voice was firm, but not unkind. "Geneva Convention. We treat wounded enemy combatants. Besides—" He hesitated. "The man's dying. Whatever he wants to say, he should get the chance to say it. You speak any Japanese?" "No, sir. Neither does anyone else here, but he seems to understand some English. Just see what he wants. Then you can go back to our boys." Daniel set down the crate and followed Morrison to a small tent at the perimeter of the hospital area, the one they used for enemy wounded, isolated, guarded, separate from the Americans who'd earned their care through blood and brotherhood. Inside the tent, on a blood-stained cot, lay a Japanese soldier who looked more like a boy, maybe 19, maybe 20. His uniform was in tatters, his left leg was mangled beyond repair, probably from a grenade, and his breathing was shallow and labored. A puncture wound in his chest made a wet, sucking sound with each breath. Pneumothorax. Fatal without immediate surgery. And they didn't have the resources for that. Not for him. But what stopped Daniel in the entrance was the soldier's eyes. They were open, lucid, and filled with something Daniel hadn't expected to see in an enemy combatant. Fear, not of death, but of something else. The soldier's gaze locked onto Daniel's medic armband, the red cross on white fabric. His cracked lips moved, forming words in broken English. "American. Doctor? Medic," Daniel corrected automatically, moving closer despite every instinct screaming at him to stay back. "I'm a medic." The Japanese soldier tried to sit up, failed, gasped in pain. Then he did something that made Daniel's blood freeze. He began to cry. Not the tears of physical pain. Daniel had seen enough wounded men to know the difference. These were tears of anguish, of psychological torment. The soldier's hand reached out, trembling toward Daniel. "Please," the soldier whispered in heavily accented English. "Please, I must. Before I die. I must." His hand clutched at Daniel's sleeve. The touch made Daniel recoil instinctively. This was the enemy, the man who'd probably killed Americans, who'd— "Forgive me," the soldier gasped. "Please, please forgive me. I beg you. American, please, forgive me." And then, with effort that obviously caused him agony, the Japanese soldier attempted to bow his head, a gesture of profound apology and submission in his culture. On a deathbed, with a sucking chest wound, he was begging forgiveness from a random American medic. Daniel stood frozen, his mind unable to process what was happening. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Enemy soldiers were supposed to fight to the death, to shout banzai, to choose suicide over surrender. They weren't supposed to cry and beg forgiveness. "Please," the soldier repeated, his voice breaking. "Please, I killed your. I cannot die without. Please." The tent felt smaller suddenly. The sound of artillery in the distance faded. All Daniel could hear was this dying boy begging for something Daniel wasn't sure he had the right or ability to give. Forgiveness. For what? For being a soldier? For following orders? For killing Americans in a war neither of them had chosen? Daniel's commander had once told him, "In war, medics are the last piece of humanity we've got left. When everyone else is trained to kill, we're trained to heal." That matters, Hayes. That matters more than you know. Standing over this dying Japanese soldier who was begging forgiveness with his last breaths, Daniel was about to discover just how much that humanity would cost him, and how much it would save him. "What's your name?" Daniel heard himself ask, his voice rougher than intended. The Japanese soldier's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised to be addressed as a person rather than an enemy. He swallowed painfully. "Kenji," he whispered. "Yamada Kenji. From Hiroshima Prefecture. My father, farmer, rice. We grow rice." The detail shouldn't have mattered, but somehow it did. Rice farmer. Daniel's own father grew corn in Nebraska. Same thing, different country. Men who worked the land, who understood seasons and soil and the simple satisfaction of watching things grow. "How old are you, Kenji?" 19. 19 years, 3 months. He coughed, blood speckling his lips. "I would be 20. Next month, May 7th. May 7th, Daniel's sister's birthday. Another detail that shouldn't matter but somehow carved into his mind like shrapnel. "I never wanted." Kenji's voice was fading, each word an effort. "I never wanted to be soldier. I wanted to be teacher, like my uncle, teach children, reading, history, but..." He gestured weakly at his destroyed uniform. "Emperor calls. We must answer." Daniel found himself kneeling beside the cot, no longer standing guard but sitting vigil. "When were you conscripted?" 2 years ago, basic training in Kyushu. Then Philippines. Then here. So much fighting. So much death." Kenji's tears continued, tracks in the dirt on his face. I tried to be good soldier. Follow orders. Protect homeland. But..." His hand reached weakly into his torn pocket, pulling out something wrapped in oiled cloth. With trembling fingers, he unwrapped it. A small photograph, creased and water-stained, but still visible. A family. Mother, father, 3 younger siblings, and a young man in civilian clothes, Kenji before the war, smiling, holding a book. The family stood in front of a modest farmhouse with rice fields visible behind them. "My family," Kenji whispered. "I write them, every week. I tell them I am good soldier. I tell them I make them proud. I tell them..." His voice broke. "I lie to them. I cannot tell them what I do, what I see, what I become." Daniel stared at the photograph. It could have been from Nebraska. Different faces, different crop, same theme, family. People who loved this boy, who waited for him to come home, who had no idea he was dying in a tent on Okinawa, begging forgiveness from a stranger. 3 days ago, Kenji continued, his voice barely audible now. "My unit. We found American soldiers. 3 of them. Separated from unit. Lost. Wounded. My commander. He ordered." Kenji's eyes closed, fresh tears squeezing out. "I did not pull trigger, but I watched. I did not stop it. 3 American boys. Maybe they have mothers. Maybe they have sisters." He looked at Daniel with such anguish that Daniel felt his own throat tighten. "Maybe they have farmers for fathers. I watched them die. I did nothing." The confession hung in the air between them. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. 3 Americans. Executed. This boy had stood by and watched. Every instinct screamed at Daniel to stand up, to walk away, to let this enemy soldier die with his guilt. But something kept him kneeling there. Maybe it was the photograph of the rice farmer's family. Maybe it was the way Kenji was only 19, the same age as Daniel's younger brother back home. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was something deeper. Something about the human capacity for both terrible things and terrible remorse. I think of them every night, Kenji whispered. I see their faces. I hear their voices begging. Like I beg now. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. I think. Maybe it is better I die here. Maybe this is justice, but... He gripped Daniel's sleeve again, desperate. I cannot die without. Someone must know. Someone American must know. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Please. Tell their families. Tell someone. Japanese soldiers say he is sorry. Daniel sat back on his heels, his mind spinning through memories he usually kept locked away. He'd been a medic for 14 months. 14 months of trying to save men whose bodies had been torn apart by bullets, shrapnel, disease, and the 1,000 casual cruelties of war. He'd held dying boys while they called for their mothers. He'd written letters to families explaining that their sons had died quickly, painlessly. Lies told out of mercy because the truth was unbearable. He'd also seen what Japanese soldiers did when they felt no mercy. At Leyte, he'd treated a Marine who'd been captured and tortured, fingernails pulled out, cigarette burns, beaten until he was unrecognizable. The Marine had been 20 years old and never spoke again after his rescue, just stared at walls until he died of his injuries 3 weeks later. Daniel had sworn then that he would never see Japanese soldiers as human, that they were the enemy, pure and simple. That mercy was weakness. But now, kneeling beside this dying 19-year-old rice farmer's son who was begging forgiveness, Daniel found his certainty crumbling. My brother volunteered, Daniel found himself saying, though he didn't know why he was sharing this. Younger than you, 17, lied about his age, wanted to serve. He's somewhere in Europe right now. I pray every night he comes home, that he doesn't have to kill anyone, that no one kills him. Kenji listened, his labored breathing the only sound. Before the war, Daniel continued, I was studying to be a teacher too. English literature. I wanted to teach kids to love reading, to see the world through books. Then Pearl Harbor happened and... He gestured at his medic armband. Here I am, trying to patch up boys who should be in college, watching them die anyway. You save lives, Kenji whispered. You are. Good man. I take lives. I am... You're 19 years old and following orders in a war you didn't start, Daniel interrupted, surprising himself with the words. Just like me. Just like every kid on this island who wants to go home. Kenji's eyes widened. You understand? Did he? Daniel wasn't sure, but he knew that this conversation, this moment, was changing something fundamental in how he saw the war, how he saw the enemy, how he saw himself. I understand, Daniel said slowly. That war makes everyone into something they don't want to be. Soldiers, killers, witnesses to horror. And I understand that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is admit he's done wrong. To seek forgiveness, even when he knows he might not deserve it. I do not deserve, Kenji agreed, his voice fading. I know. But I must ask. Before I die. I must ask. Daniel looked at this dying boy. And he was a boy, just like the Americans Daniel treated. Just like Daniel's own brother, and felt something crack open inside his chest. A wall he'd built after 14 months of war. A wall that had kept him functional, kept him able to do his job, but had also kept him from seeing the enemy as human. That wall was coming down, brick by brick, and Daniel wasn't sure if that made him stronger or weaker. He only knew that when Kenji looked at him with those pleading, dying eyes, Daniel couldn't walk away. I don't know if I can forgive you, Daniel admitted, the words raw and honest. Those 3 Americans you watched die, they might have been someone's brother, someone's son. How do I forgive that? Kenji nodded weakly, accepting the answer. You cannot. I understand. But I must still ask. Because... He coughed, blood darker now. Time was running out. Because if I do not ask, then I die with no hope. If I ask, maybe one day someone forgives. Maybe not you. Maybe their families never forgive. But I asked. I tried. The theological weight of the moment pressed on Daniel. He'd been raised Catholic, not particularly devout, but enough that concepts like confession, absolution, and redemption lived somewhere in his bones. The priest in his hometown used to say that God could forgive any sin if the sinner was truly repentant. But Daniel wasn't God. He was just a medic who'd seen too much death and was now being asked to grant forgiveness for murders he hadn't witnessed, to victims he'd never known, by a dying boy who happened to be wearing the wrong uniform. "Tell me about them," Daniel said suddenly. "The 3 Americans. What did they look like?" Kenji's face crumpled. "I try not to remember, but I cannot forget. One was tall, brown hair. He had—" Kenji's hand gestured to his own face. "Spots. Freckles?" He called for someone named Sarah before. "And the others? Young, both young, maybe 18. One had red hair, he cried very much. Said, 'Mom, I'm sorry.' The other, he was quiet, brave. He looked at my commander with no fear, said, 'My friends will avenge me.' Each detail was a knife. Daniel could picture them, kids really, barely old enough to shave, dying alone in enemy territory while a teenage Japanese soldier watched and did nothing to stop it. But he could also picture Kenji in that moment. 19 years old, far from his rice farm, watching his commander execute prisoners, knowing that to object would mean his own death, knowing that to do nothing made him complicit. Caught between the code of Bushido that demanded absolute obedience and a conscience that screamed this was wrong. "Did you want to stop it?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Kenji whispered immediately. "Every second. But I am coward. I think, if I speak, Commander kills me too. Then 4 dead instead of 3. What good does that do? So I say nothing. I watch. And now." He gestured weakly at his shattered body. "Now I pay. This is karma, I think. This is justice." "That's not how war works," Daniel said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Good people die. Bad people survive. There's no justice in it, just chaos and chance." "Maybe," Kenji agreed. "But I still must ask forgiveness. Not because I deserve it. Because they deserve to be remembered. Those 3 boys. They deserve someone to say a Japanese soldier saw you die, and he is sorry it happened. You were not forgotten. You were not just enemy casualties. They were people. I see that now. Too late, but I see." The clarity in Kenji's dying eyes suggested he understood something about war that had taken Daniel 14 months to barely grasp. That every soldier was someone's son, every enemy was someone's brother, and that the true horror of war wasn't just the killing, but the way it forced good people to do terrible things and then live with it, or die with it. Over the next hour, as Kenji's condition deteriorated, Daniel stayed. He broke protocol. He abandoned his assigned duties. He just stayed. And Kenji talked. He talked about growing up in Hiroshima, about helping his father plant rice, about the way his younger sister loved to read, and how he'd taught her kanji characters. He talked about being conscripted, about basic training where they were taught that Americans were devils, that surrender was worse than death, that the emperor was divine, and his word was absolute. He talked about his first battle in the Philippines, how terrified he'd been, how he'd frozen when the shooting started and his squad leader had slapped him and screamed at him to fight, how he'd killed his first American, a soldier about his own age, and thrown up immediately after. "I cried for 3 days, Kenji admitted. "My commander said I was weak, said I would bring shame. Other soldiers, they adapt, they stop feeling. But I never stop. Every man I kill, I see his face at night. Every American I watch die, I think. Someone loves him. Someone waits for him to come home." "Most soldiers feel that way," Daniel said quietly. "They just don't admit it. We're taught that showing emotion is weakness, that good soldiers don't think about the enemy as human, but—" He paused. "But I've held too many dying boys who cry for their mothers to believe we're any different from you. Pain is pain. Fear is fear. Doesn't matter what uniform you wear." Kenji managed a weak smile. "You would make good teacher. You understand, human heart. So would you? Daniel replied. If you'd been born in a different time, a different place. Yes, maybe in different world, you and I. We could be friends, discuss books, argue about best way to teach literature. His smile faded. Instead, we meet here, like this. The injustice of it settled over them. Two young men who would have been natural allies in peacetime, forced into opposite sides of a war they'd never wanted, meeting only because one was dying and the other was trying to save lives. Daniel, Kenji said, using his name for the first time. May I ask true favor? What? My photograph of my family, will you? He coughed, the sound wet and final. Will you keep it? Maybe. Maybe after war you can find them. Tell them. Tell them I died thinking of them. Tell them I was sorry for failing them, for not coming home, for, his voice cracked, for becoming something they would be ashamed of. Daniel took the photograph, its edges soft from being carried close to Kenji's heart for 2 years. They wouldn't be ashamed. You're dying trying to make it right. That takes more courage than any battle. You think so? I know so. Kenji's breathing was becoming more labored, each inhalation a struggle. The sucking chest wound was filling with blood. Daniel knew the signs. Maybe 30 minutes left. Maybe less. Daniel. Kenji whispered. One more thing. What? Will you stay? I do not want to die alone. I know I have no right to ask, but please. Every regulation, every protocol, every ounce of military discipline said Daniel should refuse. This was an enemy combatant. He had American wounded who needed him. He had duties. But Daniel looked at this dying 19-year-old who'd begged for forgiveness, who'd confessed his sins, who'd shared his story, and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. I'll stay, Daniel said. You won't die alone, I promise. Lieutenant Morrison found them 30 minutes later. Daniel was still kneeling beside Kenji's cot, holding the dying soldier's hand. Somewhere in the last half hour, that barrier between medic and enemy had dissolved completely. Now there was just one human being helping another through the last moments of life. Corporal Hayes, Morrison's voice was stern. We have American wounded who need... He stopped. Something in the scene made him pause. Maybe it was the way Daniel was holding Kenji's hand. Maybe it was the tears on Daniel's face. Maybe it was the Japanese soldier's expression, not hatred or defiance, but profound gratitude and peace. Sir, Daniel said without looking up, I made a promise. He's not going to make it another 30 minutes. I promised I'd stay. Morrison started to object, then sighed. Fine, but when he's gone, you get back to work. Understood. Yes, sir. After Morrison left, Kenji squeezed Daniel's hand weakly. Your commander. He is angry with you, because of me. I am sorry. Don't be. Some things matter more than following orders. Kenji's eyes drifted closed, then opened again with effort. Daniel, I must ask again, before I die. I know I ask too much. But, please, will you forgive me? For what I did? For watching those boys die? For not being brave enough to stop it? Here it was. The moment that would define everything that came after. Daniel had spent the last hour listening to this boy's confession, had heard about the rice farm in Hiroshima, about the sister who loved to read, about the dream of becoming a teacher, had heard the anguish in Kenji's voice when he described the 3 American boys dying while he watched, paralyzed by fear and military discipline, had heard genuine, soul-deep remorse. Could Daniel forgive him? Did he even have the right to? Those 3 dead Americans weren't his brothers, his friends. He was just a random medic who happened to be assigned to this tent. Who was he to grant absolution? But then Daniel thought about what forgiveness really meant. It wasn't about excusing what Kenji had done. The 3 Americans were still dead. Nothing could change that. Forgiveness didn't erase the crime or bring back the victims. But maybe forgiveness was about recognizing that people were more than their worst moments, that a 19-year-old conscript who watched something terrible happen was different from the commander who ordered it. That genuine remorse deserved acknowledgement, even if it couldn't undo the damage. Maybe forgiveness was about refusing to let war turn everyone into monsters, about preserving the possibility of humanity, even in the midst of inhumanity. Daniel took a deep breath. "Kenji," he said softly, "I can't speak for the families of those 3 soldiers. I can't absolve you on their behalf, but—" He squeezed Kenji's hand. "But I can tell you that I see your remorse. I believe it's genuine. I believe you're dying with that weight on your soul, and I believe you'd undo it if you could." "Yes," Kenji whispered. "Yes, I would give my life to undo it, but I cannot." "I know. But you can do something else. You can die knowing that one American soldier saw you, really saw you, and understood that you're not a monster. You're a boy who got caught in something bigger than himself, who made terrible choices, who regrets them, and who had the courage to seek forgiveness, even knowing you might not get it." Daniel paused, then said the words he knew would haunt and comfort him for the rest of his life. "So yes, Kenji, I forgive you, not because what you did was forgivable, but because you're human, and you asked, and refusing to forgive you won't bring anyone back. It'll just add more darkness to a world that already has too much." Kenji's face transformed. The anguish that had been etched in every line softened. Tears flowed freely now, but different tears. Relief, gratitude, peace. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Daniel. You give me gift. I can die now. I can face." He struggled for the English word. "Ancestors. I can face them. I can say, I was sorry. I asked forgiveness. One American granted it. Maybe that is enough." "It's enough," Daniel assured him. "You're enough. Your remorse is enough." They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the field hospital continuing around them. Distant screams of wounded men, shouts of doctors, the constant background percussion of artillery. But in this small tent, there was only peace. "Daniel," Kenji said, his voice barely audible now, "will you do something for me? Anything. Will you say prayer? I am Buddhist, but any prayer is good. Just so I do not die in silence." Daniel wasn't particularly religious, but he remembered prayers from childhood. He began speaking softly, partly the Lord's Prayer his mother had taught him, partly just words from his heart. God, or Buddha, or whoever watches over dying boys far from home. This is Kenji Yamada. He was a rice farmer's son from Hiroshima. He wanted to be a teacher. He made mistakes. He regrets them. He died seeking forgiveness. Please, whatever comes next, give him peace. He deserves that much." Kenji smiled, a genuine smile despite the pain. "Beautiful," he whispered. "Thank you. Tell my family, if you find them. Tell them I died in American medics' arms. Tell them American soldiers stayed with me. They will understand. It means I did not die as monster. Someone saw me as human." "I'll tell them," Daniel promised. "I'll find them after the war. I'll give them your photograph. I'll tell them everything. Everything. Everything." Daniel confirmed. "The good and the bad. What you did and what you regretted. They deserve to know their son had the courage to face his conscience at the end." "Yes," Kenji agreed. "Yes, that is good." His breathing was shallow now, each breath a longer gap than the last. Daniel held his hand tighter, offering the only comfort he could, presence. The promise that this boy wouldn't die alone, wouldn't die as just an enemy casualty number, but as a person whose life and death mattered to at least one other human being. "Daniel?" Kenji's voice was barely a whisper now. "What do you think? Happens after?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "But I like to think there's some place where war doesn't matter anymore. Where American boys and Japanese boys can just be boys again. Where teachers get to teach and farmers get to farm and nobody has to kill anybody." "I like that too," Kenji said. And then, With his last strength, he squeezed Daniel's hand one final time. Thank you for being human when you did not have to be. Those were his last words. Kenji Yamada, 19 years and 3 months old, died at 4:47 p.m. on April 4, 1945, in a field hospital on Okinawa, holding the hand of an American medic who had granted him the forgiveness he'd begged for. Daniel sat there for several minutes after, still holding Kenji's hand, tears streaming down his face. Not tears of hatred or rage, tears of grief for Kenji, for the 3 Americans Kenji had watched die, for every boy on both sides who'd been turned into soldiers and forced to do terrible things, for the waste and tragedy of it all. When he finally stood up, carefully placing Kenji's hands across his chest in a gesture of respect, Daniel felt different, changed. The wall he'd built around his heart to survive the war had come down, and he wasn't sure if that made him weaker or stronger. He only knew that he'd just lived through one of the most important moments of his life, and that Kenji's plea for forgiveness, and his own decision to grant it, would define who he became after the war ended, if he survived to see that day. When Daniel finally emerged from the tent, he found Lieutenant Morrison waiting. "He's gone?" Morrison asked. "Yes, sir." Morrison studied Daniel's face for a long moment. "You going to be okay, Corporal?" "Honestly, sir, I don't know." "What did he want? That Japanese soldier. What was so important?" Daniel looked at the photograph still in his hand. The rice farmer's family, Kenji smiling with a book. "Forgiveness, sir. He wanted to be forgiven." "Did you give it to him?" "Yes, sir." Morrison nodded slowly. "That was either the stupidest thing you've ever done or the bravest. Time will tell which." He paused. "Get cleaned up, Hayes. Then back to work. We've got Americans who need you." "Yes, sir." But as Daniel walked away, he realized that what had happened in that tent would stay with him forever. He'd crossed a line, not into enemy territory, but into a different understanding of what war really was. Not just battles and victories and defeats, but millions of individual tragedies, each one representing a boy who'd had dreams and family, and a life that got interrupted by history's cruelty. The rest of the Okinawa campaign was brutal. It would last another 2.5 months, with casualties in the hundreds of thousands on both sides. Daniel would treat countless wounded Americans, would watch too many of them die, would carry the weight of every loss. But he would also carry Kenji's photograph, and the memory of a dying boy who'd begged for forgiveness, and the knowledge that even in the midst of humanity's worst impulses, there was still room for mercy. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Daniel survived. He returned to Nebraska, tried to resume his studies, found he couldn't concentrate on literature when he kept seeing Kenji's face, kept hearing those 3 words, "Please forgive me." He'd made a promise to find Kenji's family, but Hiroshima had been destroyed by an atomic bomb on August 6th, just 4 months after Kenji's death. The city was gone. Everything was gone. Daniel spent years believing the promise was impossible to keep. He finished his degree, became a teacher like he'd planned, married, had children. But Kenji's photograph stayed in his desk drawer, a constant reminder. Then, in 1952, 7 years after the war, Daniel received a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The Japanese government was attempting to locate family members of deceased soldiers, providing information to help with war memorial preparations. Daniel wrote back immediately, sent Kenji's photograph, described their conversation, asked if the Yamada family could be found. 3 months later, he received a response. The family had survived. Kenji's parents, his 3 younger siblings, they'd evacuated to relatives outside Hiroshima 2 weeks before the bomb. They'd lived. They'd mourned Kenji, believed he'd died alone in the war, probably in some anonymous battle where his body was never recovered. And now an American medic was writing to tell them that their son's final hours had been witnessed, that he hadn't died alone, that he'd been cared for by someone who'd seen him as human. The letters that followed changed both their lives. Kenji's father wrote, "You gave my son dignity in death. You saw him as a person, not an enemy. This gift, I cannot repay it, but I can honor it. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Thank you for being merciful when you had every right to be merciless. Kenji's younger sister, Yuki, the one who loved to read, wrote, "My brother used to tell me that books could build bridges between different worlds. You proved he was right. Your kindness built a bridge between enemies, made them human again. I teach English now, like Kenji wanted to. I tell my students about you, about the American medic who forgave." The correspondence continued for years. In 1965, 20 years after Kenji's death, Daniel traveled to Japan, met the Yamada family, stood at Kenji's memorial marker, cried with his parents, now elderly and frail, but still grateful. "You kept your promise," Kenji's father said through a translator. "You found us. You told us he was sorry, that he died seeking forgiveness. That matters. More than you know, that matters." Daniel also did something he'd been planning for years. He researched the 3 American soldiers Kenji had watched die, the ones who'd haunted Kenji's final hours. Private First Class Michael Red O'Connor, 18, from Boston, called for his mother as he died. Corporal Thomas Bradley, 19, from Illinois. Freckled, called out for Sarah, his girlfriend back home. Private James Chen, 19, Chinese-American from California, died with dignity, predicted his friends would avenge him. Daniel tracked down their families, wrote letters explaining what had happened, how a Japanese soldier had witnessed their deaths, had been haunted by them, had died begging forgiveness. The responses varied. Some families were angry. Why should they care if a Japanese soldier felt guilty? Their boys were still dead. Others found comfort in knowing that their sons' deaths had affected an enemy soldier so profoundly that he'd sought forgiveness with his dying breath. Thomas Bradley's fiancée, Sarah, wrote back, "I've hated the Japanese for 20 years, hated them for taking Tom away. But your letter, knowing that one of them remembered him as a person, as someone who mattered. I don't know. It doesn't bring Tom back. But maybe it means his death wasn't meaningless. Maybe it means that even enemies can recognize each other's humanity. Maybe that's what Tom died for, the hope that someday we'd all see each other as human again." In 1975, 30 years after Kenji's death, Daniel was invited to speak at a veterans conference in San Francisco. The topic, reconciliation after war. He told Kenji's story, all of it, the begging for forgiveness, the confession, the hour spent holding a dying enemy's hand, the promise to find his family, the 27 years of correspondence that followed. The audience was silent when he finished. Then, an elderly Japanese man stood up in the back. He approached the stage slowly, and Daniel saw he was wearing a veteran's pin. Japanese Self-Defense Force, likely a WT survivor. "Mr. Hayes," the man said in accented English, "I was also at Okinawa. I was also 19. I also did things I am ashamed of. But I never had courage to ask forgiveness. I die with that shame. You're Kenji. He was braver than me." They embraced. 2 old men who'd been enemies, who'd fought on that terrible island, now standing together in California, bearing witness to the possibility of reconciliation. The moment was photographed. It appeared in newspapers, started conversations about the nature of forgiveness, about whether enemies could become human again, about what it means to heal after war. Daniel continued teaching until he retired in 1980. He always kept Kenji's photograph in his classroom, a reminder to his students that even in humanity's darkest moments, there was room for mercy, for forgiveness, for choosing to see the person behind the uniform. In 1985, 40 years after Kenji's death, Daniel was diagnosed with cancer. He had months, maybe a year. He wrote one final letter to the Yamada family. Yuki, now a grandmother, still teaching English, wrote back immediately. She came to Nebraska, visited Daniel in the hospital. "My brother's spirit is at peace because of you," she told him, holding his hand the same way he'd held Kenji's 4 decades earlier. "You gave him the gift of dying with hope instead of despair. That is not a small thing, Mr. Hayes. That is everything." "I've thought about that day every single day since it happened," Daniel admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, if I had the right to forgive him when I wasn't the one he'd wronged. You had the right because you had the courage, Yuki said. Forgiveness takes more bravery than revenge. You chose the harder path. My brother knew that. That's why he thanked you. Not just for forgiving, but for being brave enough to see him as human when it would have been easier to see him as a monster. Daniel died on June 12, 1985. He was 63 years old. At his funeral, there was an unexpected attendee, Yuki Yamada, representing her family. She placed a single white chrysanthemum on his casket, a Japanese symbol of truth and grief. He saved my brother's soul, she told Daniel's children. In war, that matters as much as saving his body, maybe more. Today, the story of Daniel Hayes and Kenji Yamada is taught in both American and Japanese schools as an example of wartime reconciliation. The photograph of the two veterans embracing in San Francisco hangs in the Peace Memorial Museum in Hiroshima. Daniel's children donated his personal papers to the University of Nebraska. Among them, 40 years of correspondence with the Yamada family. Kenji's photograph, worn from being carried in Daniel's pocket. Journal entries describing that April day when a dying enemy soldier begged for forgiveness. And a letter Daniel wrote but never sent, dated April 5, 1945, the day after Kenji died. I'm writing this because I need to remember. I need to remember that today I met a boy named Kenji, who was no different from me except for the uniform he wore. I need to remember that he cried for his mother, loved his family, had dreams of being a teacher. I need to remember that he was capable of both terrible guilt and profound remorse. I need to remember because it's easier to hate enemies when you don't see them as human. And this war requires so much hatred to continue. But today, I chose to forgive instead of hate. I don't know if that makes me a good soldier or a bad one. I only know that when I die, I want to be the kind of man who could look a dying enemy in the eye and grant him mercy. Because in the end, we're all just boys far from home, trying to survive something bigger than ourselves. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is refuse to let war make us into monsters. I forgave Kenji today. I forgave him because he asked, because he was sincere, because refusing wouldn't bring anyone back. But also because forgiving him meant I could forgive myself for all the times I failed to be fully human in this war. Maybe that's selfish. Maybe his forgiveness mattered less than my need to believe I could still be merciful. But I think Kenji understood. I think he knew that we were saving each other in that tent, him from dying with guilt, me from living without humanity. So I'll remember. I'll keep my promise to find his family. I'll honor his memory by refusing to see enemies as monsters. That's what forgiveness means to me now. Not excusing what was done, but refusing to let violence define who we are. Kenji taught me that. A dying Japanese soldier taught me what it means to be fully human. I will never forget him. 79 years later, that lesson still echoes.